So today we're going to talk about Pierre Poilievre. He went on the Jordan Peterson show. I recommend everyone listen to it. It was a great interview. He really lays out his plan for Canada and, the difference between him and what the Liberals have done the last 10 years, kind of how that's hurt Canadians, put us in a really bad spot that, he's going to have to try to get us out of, and how I think there's hope for Canada in the future. I think he's got a lot of really good ideas, a lot of things that'll make a big impact on Canada and the economy.
It's really not good when your economy is set up to punish people who are entrepreneurial and hardworking.
And that's what it does. Right?
Okay, so let's delve into that a little bit. So I've been tracking economic statistics in relationship to Canada and sort of left me open-mouthed in amazement at our dismal condition. So from what I've been able to understand, the richest people per capita in terms of GDP per person, gross domestic product per person, so that's total productivity, is Ontario. Ontario inhabitants are now poorer per capita than inhabitants of Mississippi, and that's the poorest American state. So the inhabitants of Canada's richest province are poorer than the inhabitants of the United States' poorest state. And that's actually occurred primarily in the last 10 years.
It's really incredible. Like 10 years ago, the New York Times wrote an article, Welcome to Canada, we're home of the world's most affluent middle class. And in that article, the Times had calculated that median American and Canadian incomes were tied and that Canadians were slightly better off. Now, part of that was because the 08-09 financial crisis hit them harder than it hit us. But still, now per capita GDP in the States is $22,000 higher than in Canada, measured in USD. So that's about almost 30,000 measured in.
Right. So that's a whole other income, essentially.
Yeah.
That's a whole other part-time income.
Exactly.
To me, the biggest thing, you can cut a little bit, you can cut a lot, but it's not going to make a huge dent in it. You have to actually grow the economy. And that's where I get excited when Pierre talks, is he does have, it seems like a lot of good plans to do that, to build more homes, to grow the economy. He said he's had conversations with both Danielle Smith and Scott Moe so that we can have projects ready to go as soon as he's in to get the energy sector going. Things like that will do way more for balancing the budget than cutting. We need to stop printing so much money and wasting it on stupid stuff, but it is going to be a small drop in the bucket. We can't cut our way out of this. We're way too far in. You're going to have to grow the economy massively and make the ratio of debt to GDP less, and that will put us in a lot better spot as a country. Cutting can definitely help, but there's certain things like our healthcare system and even just the interest on the debt that you can't cut that right away. You're still going to have to pay that, our military spending. So we can cut all the frivolous stuff, but that's not going to be 50% of the deficit, right? We have to grow our way out of it, and that's going to be the easiest path. The other reality about cutting, and Pierre talks about this later on in this interview, is he kind of jokes that the Liberals got the party and now he's going to inherit the hangover, is cutting, it sounds great and I'm all for it. I think we need to cut a ton of government spending, but that usually comes with cutting a lot of jobs. And, that money is going somewhere and now it's going to stop. So if that's bureaucracy, most likely it is government jobs that are getting cut. That's a ton of people that are out of work. So there's always going to be temporary pain. That's why most governments don't do it. Politically, it's very hard to do that, to go cut tons of jobs and tons of funding to programs that we're running in order for, a long-term gain, and your election cycle is only 4 years. You can look at countries like Argentina, they're getting out of a deficit, they're doing all these great things, but the people who actually live there, there's a lot of pain right now. Tons of people that had jobs don't have work right now, and that's going to be temporary, right? Over a long enough period of time, you're going to climb out of the deficit and be in a great spot, but it's very hard to stay the course and actually do that. Now, growing the economy is a much easier thing. Everybody benefits from that, right? And I think you can kind of do them in tandem. You can cut things as you're growing the economy, and it's kind of a double win. So for years now, the Liberal government has been, with their immigration policy, bringing in way more people than the country can support, and that has brought our GDP up, right? So it has kept us from being in a recession because every person that comes in brings a certain amount of GDP. So they've kind of artificially inflated this bubble. In reality, the GDP per person has went down. Now we're seeing unemployment go up. We're seeing production of people go down. And all these things are happening. So they've temporarily kept the economy, going from a number standpoint. But the reality is it's actually gotten much worse. The other thing that the Liberal Party does all of the time is they compare us to the other G7 countries, and they say, if you look at our GDP per debt, we're in a really good spot, envy of the world, all these things. But what Canada does different than a lot of countries is the way that our programs work, like healthcare and things like that. A lot of that debt actually goes on the provinces. So if you add the provincial debt and the federal debt, we're not in a great spot at all. It's much worse than they say. If you look at their last budget, I don't know, it was like 50 times or how many times they mentioned that our GDP per debt was actually in a good spot compared to other countries. And the reality is that's not an accurate statement at all if you look at provincial debt and transfers and things like that.
We're more indebted as households than the Americans were right before the 2008 financial crisis. And so what we have as a model in Canada is we have artificial scarcity imposed by a very heavy and restrictive state, confiscatory state. So that suppresses production. Mm-hmm. But in order to allow for consumption, we print money and borrow money and then flood the economy with that money.
Okay, so that's another problem. So that's the inflationary problem.
Yes.
Now, the problem with inflation, there's many problems with inflation, but one of them is that it particularly punishes people who are thrifty and who save.
Yes.
Right. So inflation punishes the people who forego gratification to invest in the future.
That's right.
Right. So that's a very bad idea.
It's a horrible. Inflation is the single most immoral tax for so many reasons. One, it takes from savers and people who are trying to be responsible, thus making it impossible to be responsible, because you will, if you refuse to play the inflation game of borrowing money to buy things you can't afford, someone else inevitably will, and you won't be able to afford anything. Mm-hmm. So you ultimately have to act irresponsibly. It's like Milton Friedman was asked, what would you do with your money in times of inflation? He said, spend it.
Right.
Like the first thing you want to do when inflation is out of control is to make sure you get rid of this thing that's losing its value. The second reason it's immoral is it takes from the poor, because the poorest people they do not have the ability to buy inflation-proof assets like gold and real estate and fancy watches and art collections and fancy wines and things that go up with or even exceed inflation. So it's a very big wealth transfer from the poor and the working class to the very, very wealthy. A very small group of people actually get richer.
So the socialist policies that provide goods and services to Canadians, let's say, or denizens of other countries, by printing money, actually punish the poor brutally.
Oh, absolutely.
In consequence of the inflation that they generate.
Yes. I mean, all the socialist policies in practice redistribute from the working class to the super wealthy in practice. And I can prove that again and again and again.
Theory.
In practice.
Yeah.
In practice, all the redistribution that happens in these so-called socialist countries ultimately goes from the working class to the super wealthy.
Pierre talks in this interview a little bit about how, production in Canada, production per employee has went down about half since Trudeau's got in, right? So we used to be at par with the States, and now we're at $15,000. They're at $28,000 that's per employee. So that's a huge gap. And that again, why does a business want to run here if our production's that much lower? They're going to spend way more money on improving stuff and BD, things like that. And their number's going to get higher and higher, and ours will get lower if things don't change. There's just too much red tape. Things like the carbon tax, they always do say it's actually a cost neutral. Most people get money back, that sort of things. But if you look at the numbers on what they say that does to our economy, it's a huge impact, right, on the decrease in GDP because of the carbon tax. So it makes a big, big difference. Another thing interesting about the next election, Pierre and kind of his whole team, Jamil Jivani, I think his name is, he's a conservative MP that just got elected. He went to Yale with J.D. Vance, and apparently they're still really good friends. So it never hurts to have someone, who's on the same page as the vice president in the States. And I do think you see, Trump and his team kind of taking shots at Trudeau and Freeland and doing these things. They always speak very highly of Pierre. So I think having someone in Parliament that has a mandate from the people. So after the next election, if it's a blowout, which I hope it is, having him be, kind of have the ear of the president, that could go a long way, not just for Canada, but for North America, right? Instead of kind of having an adversary on both sides of the border.